When Thomas Reeves knelt alone at his brother's neglected grave in Arlington, he never expected to make national headlines. His weathered hands worked methodically, scrubbing away years of institutional neglect. Then it happened. The unmistakable sound of marching footsteps approached through the rain-soaked cemetery. He wasn't alone anymore. This isn't just about one forgotten veteran. It's about what happens when a single act of devotion challenges an entire system. The first drops of rain spattered against Thomas Reeves' weathered hands as he knelt before the neglected headstone. Around him, Arlington National Cemetery stretched in orderly rows, a sea of white markers under a darkening October sky. But here, in the oldest section, his brother's grave lay forgotten, moss creeping across the edges, dirt obscuring the inscription. Thomas brushed away debris with careful fingers. "I'm here, Jack," he whispered, like I promised. He'd come armed with supplies, a small brush, cleaning solution, and a determination that had sustained him through the 5-hour bus ride for Pennsylvania. At 62, his movements were slower than during his own military days, but his hands remained steady as they had been when he'd served as a medic in Desert Storm. A groundskeeper in a golf cart slowed nearby, frowning at Thomas. "Sir, we have staff who handle maintenance. Visitors aren't supposed to. My brother's grave hasn't been properly tended in years," Thomas said without looking up. "I've submitted 3 formal requests. There are procedures." The man's voice carried the weary tone of bureaucracy. "Forms that need to be filed, approvals. It's been 8 months since my first request." Thomas continued methodically cleaning the marker. "Jack deserves better. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to stop." The groundskeeper stepped closer. "This is government property." Thomas finally looked up. Rain was falling steadily now, plastering his gray hair to his forehead. "My brother gave his life for his country in Vietnam. He died saving 4 other men." He gestured to the surrounding graves. "All these men and women deserve proper care, not just the ones in the sections tourists visit." A radio crackled at the groundskeeper's belt. "I understand your frustration, but rules are rules. I'll have to call security if you continue." Thomas turned back to his work, then called them. The groundskeeper hesitated, then retreated to his cart and spoke into his radio. Thomas knew he had perhaps 15 minutes before security arrived. He worked faster, his fingers tracing the letters of his brother's name. Jackson Howard Reeves, Specialist, Vietnam. Rain soaked through Thomas's jacket as he cleaned, his mind drifting to childhood memories. Jack teaching him to fish, Jack leaving for Vietnam, the telegram that arrived 6 months later. Their mother had insisted Jack be buried at Arlington, a hero's resting place. Thomas had promised her he'd make sure Jack was never forgotten. Yet here was his brother's grave, neglected in an old section that rarely saw visitors. The new veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan received fresh flowers and regular maintenance. The Vietnam veterans, especially those in the older sections, seemed to fade from memory with each passing year. Thomas had followed the proper channels. He'd called the cemetery office repeatedly. He'd written letters to the Department of Veterans Affairs. He'd been promised action, then forgotten, just like the veterans whose graves slowly disappeared under encroaching nature. "Sir," a new voice cut through the rainfall. "I need you to stop what you're doing." Thomas looked up to find a security officer standing over him, hand resting casually near his holster. Beyond him, a small crowd had gathered, 2 more security personnel and several visitors seeking shelter under umbrellas. "I'm almost finished," Thomas said. "That's not how this works." The officer's voice hardened. "Either you stop now, or we'll have to escort you for the premises." Thomas slowly rose to his feet, his knees protesting. Even standing at his full height, he barely reached the officer's shoulder. Yet something in Thomas's expression made the younger man step back slightly. "My brother died with honor," Thomas said, voice cutting through the rainfall. "He deserves to be remembered with honor. Look around you." He gestured to the older section of the cemetery. How many of these graves receive the same attention as those in the newer sections? How many families have tried to ensure their loved ones aren't forgotten, only to be told to file another form? The officer's eyes flicked to the crowd that had gathered. Sir, this isn't the appropriate venue. Then what is? Thomas's voice never rose, but gained intensity. I've been writing letters for 8 months. My brother's headstone isn't the only one neglected. There's a systematic failure here. The older the grave, the less attention it receives. The further from public view, the less care is given. As if nature itself sought to emphasize his point, a sudden gust of wind sent a cascade of water from a nearby tree, revealing several more moss-covered stones. The security officer shifted uncomfortably. I understand your concern, but I have my orders. And I have mine, Thomas replied. A promise to my mother before she died. A promise to my brother. More people had gathered now, tourists seeking shelter from the rain under nearby trees. They watched the confrontation unfold with curious eyes. This isn't just about my brother's grave anymore, Thomas said, voice steady despite the rain streaming down his face. It's about every veteran who's been forgotten after the parades end and the speeches finish. The security officer's radio crackled, and he stepped away to respond. Thomas took the opportunity to kneel once more and continue his work, aware that each motion might be his last before being forcibly removed. Behind him, phones emerged from pockets as onlookers began recording the scene. The security officer returned, his expression strained. Sir, my supervisor is on his way. Until then, I've been instructed to monitor the situation. Thomas nodded once and returned to his task. The rain continued to fall, but he no longer felt its chill. He cleaned his brother's headstone with the precision of a man performing a sacred duty, conscious that with each stroke, he was fighting not just for Jack, but for every forgotten veteran lying beneath the sodden earth. The administration building of Arlington National Cemetery projected an aura of solemn efficiency. Thomas sat stiffly in a chair too small for comfort, his wet clothes creating a small puddle beneath him. Across the desk, Cemetery Director Marshall Preston reviewed the security report with pursed lips. Mr. Reeves, while I appreciate your dedication to your brother's memory, we have protocols in place for a reason. Preston's voice carried the practiced patience of a man accustomed to explaining rules to the grieving. Unauthorized maintenance of grave sites could potentially cause damage. With respect, sir, neglect has already caused damage. Thomas placed a folder on the desk between them. These are copies of my correspondence over the past 8 months. 3 formal requests for maintenance, 5 follow-up calls, 2 letters to the VA. Preston barely glanced at the folder. We receive thousands of such requests annually, Mr. Reeves. Our staff works diligently. I took these yesterday. Thomas slid several photographs across the desk. They showed not just Jack's grave, but an entire section of neglected headstones. Moss-obscured names, dirt-filled engravings. Some markers listed at concerning angles. This isn't just about my brother. Preston's expression tightened. Mr. Reeves, you're not the first family member to feel their loved one deserves special attention. No special attention, Thomas interrupted. Equal attention. The door opened, and a woman in her mid-30s entered, her uniform identifying her as Deputy Director of Operations. Sorry I'm late, sir, she said to Preston. The media situation is escalating. Media situation? Preston's head snapped up. Yes, sir. The incident with Mr. Reeves has gone viral. Several news outlets are requesting statements. Thomas watched Preston's face transition from annoyance to calculation. Ms. Alvarez, please escort Mr. Reeves to the conference room. I'll join you shortly. Alvarez led Thomas through a maze of hallways to a small conference room. Once inside, she closed the door and turned to him with unexpected warmth. My grandfather served in Vietnam, she said quietly. 82nd Airborne. He's buried in Section 27. Thomas studied her face, noting the sincerity in her eyes. How's his grave maintained? Honestly, I check it myself every month. She gestured for him to sit. Mr. Reeves, what most visitors don't realize is that we're chronically understaffed and underfunded. The Appropriations Committee keeps cutting our maintenance budget while the number of interments increases yearly. That doesn't excuse systematic neglect of older sections, Thomas said. No, it doesn't. She pulled out her phone and showed him an email. I've been documenting the deterioration for 3 years. I've sent quarterly reports to the Department of Army with specific maintenance requests. They keep getting denied or delayed. Thomas leaned forward. Why are you telling me this? Because you've done something I couldn't. Her voice lowered. You brought attention to the issue. The videos of you cleaning your brother's grave while security stands by, they're everywhere. Hashtag remember them all is trending. Thomas blinked in surprise. He didn't own a smartphone and had no social media presence. I wasn't trying to create a spectacle. Sometimes the most powerful statements are unintentional. She hesitated, then pulled out a flash drive. This contains my documentation of budget reallocations over the past 5 years. Funds designated for maintenance of older sections have been diverted to newer, more visited areas and administrative costs. Before Thomas could respond, Preston entered with another man, tall, military-bearing, wearing an expensive suit. Mr. Reeves, this is Richard Hargrove, Department of the Army Public Affairs. Preston's tone had transformed to one of conciliatory diplomacy. He'd like to discuss a resolution to this unfortunate situation. Hargrove extended his hand. Mr. Reeves, the department deeply regrets any distress caused by maintenance delays. We're prepared to make this right. Thomas didn't take the offered hand. Make it right for whom? Just my brother, or all the veterans whose graves have been neglected? Hargrove's smile tightened. We understand your concern extends beyond your brother's grave. We're prepared to implement an immediate maintenance plan for the section in question. Just that section? Thomas asked. What about the other older sections facing the same neglect? Hargrove and Preston exchanged glances. Resources are allocated based on visitor traffic and based on which graves might embarrass you if photographed. Thomas finished. That's not honoring service. That's managing appearances. The air in the room grew thick with tension. Thomas thought of Jack, always the bold one, always willing to speak truth regardless of consequence, and found himself channeling his brother's courage. Gentlemen, Thomas said, rising slowly to his feet, I'm not interested in special treatment for my brother's grave. I'm interested in equal treatment for all who served, whatever their era, whatever their location in the cemetery. Alvarez watched him with carefully concealed approval as Hargrove's expression hardened. Mr. Reeves, we're trying to be reasonable here. The department is prepared to issue a formal apology and ensure your brother's grave receives immediate attention. And what about the soldier buried next to him? Or the one 3 rows back? Thomas shook his head. I won't accept preferential treatment as hush money. Preston's face flushed. No one is offering hush money. Then what would you call it? The room fell silent. Outside the window, Thomas could see visitors moving among the graves in the distance. Umbrellas unfurled against the persistent drizzle. Somewhere out, there was Jack and thousands like him, their memories fading beneath neglect. My father served in Korea, Thomas said quietly. When he died, our mother insisted Jack be buried here rather than our hometown cemetery. Arlington is forever, she said. They never forget their own there. He met Hargrove's gaze steadily. She was wrong, wasn't she? No one answered. Thomas reached for his worn jacket. I'll be returning to my brother's grave now. I still have work to finish. Mr. Reeves, Hargrove said, I strongly advise against further unauthorized activities. For your own sake. Thomas paused at the door. My brother died, ensuring no one was left behind on the battlefield. The least I can do is ensure he's not left behind in memory. As he walked out, Alvarez's eyes met his briefly. Her fingers tapping meaningfully on the flash drive she'd returned to her pocket. Thomas gave her a slight nod before stepping into the hallway, aware that he had just crossed a line from which there was no retreat. The late afternoon sun broke through the clouds as Thomas returned to Jack's grave. The rain had stopped, leaving the cemetery glistening under patches of emerging blue sky. A small crowd had gathered near the section entrance, some with cameras, others with flowers. Thomas nodded to them politely as he passed, unsure why they'd congregated in this normally deserted section. He knelt once more before his brother's headstone, now partially cleaned. The inscribed name stood out more clearly, Jackson Howard Reeves. Thomas resumed his work, aware of whispers behind him, but focused entirely on his task. Mr. Reeves? Thomas looked up to find a young woman in an army dress uniform standing beside him, her insignia identifying her as a captain. Yes, Captain Sarah Rodriguez, ma'am. I'm with the Old Guard. She hesitated. Sir, I wanted to personally thank you. Thomas frowned in confusion. For what? My grandfather is buried 3 sections over. Vietnam veteran, like your brother. His grave, she swallowed. It's been years since it received proper maintenance. From behind her, an older man stepped forward. Same with my father's grave. Coreo, ezer kilen sazutvenek. I filed 7 maintenance requests in 3 years. Suddenly, Thomas realized the crowd wasn't there to observe. They were family members of veterans buried in the neglected sections. People who had fought the same bureaucratic battles he had, with the same lack of results. A shadow fell across Thomas as more people approached. Among them was Alvarez, accompanied by several news crews and a distinguished-looking man in his 70s, leaning heavily on a cane. Mr. Reeves, she said, this is Congressman Joseph Warren. He chairs the House Veterans Affairs Committee. The congressman extended his hand. Mr. Reeves, your actions today have brought attention to an issue I've been fighting to address for years. Would you mind if we talk? Before Thomas could respond, a commotion at the section entrance drew everyone's attention. A formation of soldiers in full dress uniform marched into view, accompanied by a military band. At their lead was a stern-faced colonel, his chest bearing rows of combat decorations. The crowd parted as the formation approached Jack's grave. Thomas rose slowly to his feet, bewildered by the sudden appearance of what appeared to be a full honor guard. The colonel halted before Thomas and saluted sharply. Mr. Reeves, Colonel James Winters, 3rd Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard. Permission to render proper honors to Specialist Reeves. Thomas stood speechless, his cleaning supplies still in hand. The colonel's eyes held something unexpected. Not the bureaucratic defensiveness Thomas had encountered all day, but shame and determination. Yes, Thomas finally managed. At a signal from the colonel, the band began to play a solemn rendition of America the Beautiful. The honor guard moved with precision to form a semicircle around Jack's grave. From their ranks, 2 soldiers stepped forward with a folded flag. This morning, when your story broke, something extraordinary happened, Colonel Winters said quietly as the music continued. Soldiers from across the base began coming to me, from privates to senior officers, all saying the same thing. Sir, we need to make this right. The colonel gestured to the assembled formation. Every person here is a volunteer, off duty on their own time. When we fail to honor those who came before us, we fail ourselves. Thomas's vision blurred with unexpected tears as the honor guard performed a ceremony typically reserved for new interments. The band played, the flag was presented with solemn dignity, and a solitary bugler stepped forward to play taps, its haunting notes floating across the cemetery. As the final notes faded, Thomas noticed Congressman Warren speaking intently with a cluster of reporters, Alvarez at his side, holding open a folder, the evidence she had compiled. Colonel, Thomas said, finding his voice, I appreciate this honor for my brother, but what about the others? He gestured to the surrounding graves. They all deserve the same respect. The colonel nodded. That's why I brought this. He handed Thomas a document. This is our commitment, signed by every commanding officer at Fort Myer, to establish a volunteer program specifically for maintaining the older sections of Arlington. We're calling it Legacy Watch. As Thomas read the document, a reporter approached. Mr. Reeves, Congressman Warren has just announced an emergency congressional hearing on maintenance funding for national cemeteries. He cited your brother's case specifically. More cameras turned toward them as the reporter continued. He's also revealed documentation showing systematic diversion of maintenance fund from older sections to administrative costs and VIP ceremonies. Can you comment on this revelation? Thomas looked from the document in his hands to Jack's partially cleaned headstone. The sunlight had strengthened, illuminating the white marble and the words now clearly visible. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man laid down his life for his friends. This was never about one grave, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. It was about keeping a promise, not just mine and my brother, but our nation's promise to remember those who served. The cameras pressed closer as Thomas continued. Every headstone here represents someone's brother, father, mother, sister, son, or daughter. Someone who answered when their country called. The true measure of our gratitude isn't found in speeches on Memorial Day. It's in how we remember when no one's watching. As Thomas spoke, several of the volunteer soldiers had quietly begun cleaning nearby headstones. The simple act spread through their ranks like a wave, dress uniforms bent in service to forgotten markers. Colonel Winters stepped forward. Today marks a change, he announced. Not just a ceremony for one fallen soldier, but a recommitment to all who rest here. Thomas watched as the movement spread beyond the military formation to the gathered families, who began tending to their own loved ones' graves. Someone started singing Amazing Grace, the melody picked up first by the band and then by dozens of voices. The cemetery, usually maintained in respectful silence, resonated with sound and purpose. As Thomas turned back to finish cleaning Jack's headstone, he felt a presence beside him. Congressman Warren had knelt despite his age, offering to help. Your brother's legacy just changed how we honor all our fallen, the congressman said quietly. Sometimes it takes one person refusing to look away to make everyone else see what's been in front of them all along. Thomas nodded, unable to speak as his weathered hands completed the work he'd come to do, revealing at last his brother's name and rank in full clarity against the white stone, no longer obscured by neglect or indifference. 6 months later, Thomas stood at the entrance to Arlington's Section 29, barely recognizing the transformation before him. What had been a neglected corner of the cemetery now displayed the same immaculate care as the most visited sections. White headstones gleamed in perfect rows, each one clean, each name clearly legible. Quite a change, isn't it? Alvarez appeared beside him, now wearing the insignia of acting director. Preston had retired weeks after the congressional hearings revealed the extent of the mismanagement. Jack would approve, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. They walked together through the section, past groundskeepers attentively maintaining the area. Some wore cemetery uniforms, others military fatigues, and still others civilian clothes with Legacy Watch patches. The volunteer program has expanded to 27 national cemeteries, Alvarez said. Over 10,000 regular volunteers nationwide. We can't keep up with the applications. Thomas nodded, noting how visitors now wandered through these once empty pathways. Many carried flowers or small flags, paying respects to veterans long neglected. At Jack's grave, Thomas found a small group waiting. Colonel Winters, Captain Rodriguez, and to his surprise, a class of middle school students with their teacher. Mr. Reeves, the teacher said, extending her hand, I'm Lisa Jennings. My students have been corresponding with you as part of our History Alive project. Thomas smiled at the children, recognizing the school name from the dozens of letters he'd received. It's wonderful to meet you all in person. A girl stepped forward, clutching a folder. We researched your brother's unit in Vietnam, she said. We found stories about how he saved his platoon. We also interviewed other families who have relatives buried here. A boy added, we're publishing their stories on our website, so they won't be forgotten. Colonel Winters gestured to a nearby maintenance cart. The Legacy Watch rotation schedule is working well. Each section receives attention at least twice weekly now. And the funding? Thomas asked. Congressman Warren's bill passed last month, Rodriguez answered. Mandatory minimum maintenance standards for all national cemeteries, with specific allocations that can't be diverted, plus annual inspections by independent veterans groups. As they spoke, a small ceremony began at a grave several rows away, another family receiving the closure that proper remembrance brings. Such scenes have become common since the program began. Alvarez touched Thomas's arm. There's something else you should see. She led the group to a newly installed plaque near the section entrance. Thomas stopped short when he read the inscription. The Reeves Initiative for Veteran Memorial Preservation. No one forgotten, no service unacknowledged. Established 2025 following the actions of Thomas Reeves, who reminded a nation of its enduring debt to those who served. Thomas stared at the plaque, speechless. Colonel Winters smiled at his reaction. The Secretary of the Army approved it personally, the colonel said. Your stand that day did more than clean one headstone. It changed the entire system. The school children gathered around as Thomas ran his fingers over the raised letters. One girl raised her hand. Mr. Reeves, our teacher said you were just an ordinary citizen. How did you know you could make all this happen? Thomas thought for a moment, remembering the rain-soaked confrontation that had started everything. I didn't, he answered honestly. I just knew I couldn't walk away from something that was wrong, even if fixing it seemed impossible. Later, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the cemetery, Thomas sat alone by Jack's grave. The grounds had quieted, visitors departing as closing time approached. He placed his hand on the cool marble. Remember how you always said, one person can't change anything? Thomas said softly, turns out you were wrong about that, Jack. He thought about the changes of the past 6 months, the congressional hearings, the funding reforms, the volunteers now spanning the country. All because he'd refused to accept that some heroes deserved less remembrance than others. A groundskeeper appeared, nodding respectfully to Thomas before moving to tend a nearby grave. Beyond him, Thomas could see a Legacy Watch volunteer instructing a new recruit on proper cleaning techniques. The system hadn't just been temporarily fixed, it had been transformed. Thomas recalled the rain-drenched day when he'd knelt alone at this grave, determined to fulfill a promise. He'd never imagined that his simple act of devotion would ripple outward, touching thousands of lives and changing national policy. Rising slowly, Thomas brushed his fingertips across Jack's name one final time. The setting sun caught the polished surface, making the letters glow with warm light. All around him, gleaming white markers stretched in perfect formation, each one representing a life, each one now receiving the honor it deserved. As Thomas walked toward the cemetery gates, he passed a young family entering despite the late hour. The father carried cleaning supplies similar to those Thomas had brought 6 months earlier. You here for the Legacy Watch program? Thomas asked. The man nodded. My grandfather's buried in Section 18. Coréen va vétéran. For years we couldn't even read his name properly. He gestured to his children. I want them to understand what it means to keep a promise. Thomas smiled. They couldn't have a better teacher. He continued toward the exit, passing beneath trees that had once shed rain upon his solitary vigil. The cemetery now felt different. Not just a repository of the past, but a living testament to an enduring commitment. At the main gate, Thomas paused and looked back at the endless rows of white markers, now bathed in golden evening light. In the distance, he could just make out Jack's section, where a lone figure in uniform stood at attention beside a grave, a silent guardian ensuring no veteran would ever again be forgotten. Thomas had come to clean a single grave and found himself changing a nation's understanding of remembrance. The rain-soaked confrontation had washed away years of neglect, revealing a deeper truth. Honor isn't measured in grand ceremonies or polished speeches, but in the steady commitment to remember, name by name, grave by grave, day after day. As he turned to leave, Thomas whispered words meant for Jack, but embracing all who rested there. Rest easy, brother. Your watch is covered now. Have you been moved by this story of perseverance and honor? Consider taking action in your own community by volunteering with veteran memorial preservation programs or supporting legislation that ensures proper maintenance of military cemeteries. One person truly can make a difference. Share this story to inspire others to stand up for what's right, even when standing alone. Asterisk.